Morning, Caroline. Morning, Caroline. Morning, Elizabeth. Morning, Philip. Morning, Elizabeth.
Morning.
I was wondering whether anybody could hear me there for a minute, but obviously you can, so that's good.
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Very much. Just wait for a few more people to join.
I'm on time for a change.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I was only just on time myself, I have to say.
Well, it was quite, you had to log into Eventbrite and then one thing and another.
Always a bit convoluted, isn't it?
Yeah, it's somebody else coming in, so you're not alone.
That's great.
I'm going to mute now.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Morning, Caroline.
Hiya.
Morning, Philip. Just give other people a couple more minutes to join. Okay, so thank you for joining us, everybody. I'm going to make a start. If anybody else joins, I'll just let them into the meeting as it proceeds. So it's quite a small group this morning, so I'm going to run through some presentation material with you and tell you all about why we should care about cybersecurity. As it's quite a small group, I think if you've got any questions as we go through, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask them at the relevant point, or you can add questions into the chat and we'll pick them up at the end. I will leave a little bit of time at the end as well for questions, so feel free to ask them either as we go through, put them into the chat, or as I say, leave them until the end. That's okay with everybody. Hopefully everybody can see my presentation slide. Perhaps someone can just give me a yes or a nod just to let me know you can see that. Great, Caroline's giving me a nod. Thank you very much, Caroline. So yeah, thank you for taking the time out of your days this morning. I'm going to, this is a presentation that we do quite a lot, and it's really just about raising awareness amongst businesses, business owners, leadership teams, really about why cybersecurity is important, if you don't know already. So let's make a start. So these are some examples of things that I hear all the time when I'm talking to various types of businesses around cybersecurity. So you get lots of a range of different levels of anxiety, I guess, and awareness around cybersecurity and information security. And some organizations are very worried about it and put lots of kind of effort into it and time into it and investment into protection, and then you obviously have the other end of the scale. And these are some examples of things that I hear quite a lot. And these fall into different categories, really. So we've got some sort of really, these are all, I have another slide on another presentation that we're doing, not in this one, and it's called Myths, Misconceptions and Mistakes. And most of the things that you see here on this slide, if not all of them, are on that myths, misconceptions and mistakes slide as well. So what I want to try and do in this session is not talk to these specifically, but just give you an idea around what some of the risks are, why things happen, how they're happening, how things happening in the world affect that, and why those are relevant to businesses of all types, all sizes, and hopefully give you a bit of an insight into that, and then also give you a little bit of insight into some things that you can do immediately and in the future if you're kind of convinced, or if you feel like you're not doing enough, perhaps some things that you can do to kind of address some of these areas. Morning, Glenn, thanks for joining us. We just made a start, so background is just these are some things that on the slide that you can see here, hopefully, things that I hear from different types of businesses all the time. So I'm going to try and address some of these in the session that we're going to go through this morning. This is just something that kind of I feel from my experience working in this field is that there's a lot of organisations who do ask for help around cybersecurity, and actually there's lots that don't, and those that need the help the most quite often are the ones that are the least likely to ask. And there's a couple of different kind of, I guess, underlying reasons for that. One is quite common, that if you're running a business or you've got a role in a business, cybersecurity and information security are probably not your key areas of concern, right? That's not your role. There's lots of other things going on, particularly if you're a business owner. You've got, I certainly know there's 1,000 things going on all the time, competing for my time and attention. So cybersecurity might not be one of those. And I guess as with a lot of things, you don't know what you don't know. So our job is to kind of educate on some of those things from a security point of view to help you know about the things that you don't perhaps you're not aware of at the moment. So that's something we can do. There are also organizations, businesses, people within business who perhaps don't want to know, right? Maybe you're vaguely aware that there's some cybersecurity problem, but as soon as you start to think about it, you start to discover lots of other things that you need to do, which might cost some money, will take some time, might take some resources, and perhaps that's something that you don't want to deal with right now. So that's quite common as well. It is something that affects all type of businesses. One of the comments that I showed on my sort of second slide was something along the lines of, we're not a target for cyber criminals because we're in X line of business, right? So charities, healthcare, you might think that you wouldn't be targeted because that wouldn't be an ethical thing to do. Obviously, we're talking about cyber criminals, right? So ethics and morals are not perhaps at the forefront of their thinking. But there's also lots of other kind of lines of business and verticals where you might not think that actually cybersecurity is something particularly relevant to you. I've picked on agriculture as an example on this slide, obviously because we're working with the RNAA on this presentation. And this is actually, there's a group called Cyber Resilience Centres, which are around the UK, which I'm involved in, so outside of the Cyberscale business, which I'll talk a little bit about that later on. I'm involved in something called Cyber Resilience Centres. There's a number of those around the country. They are collaborations between policing and businesses, and they're really there to kind of help educate all types of organizations around cybersecurity, what the risks are, what they can do about it, and they do provide some free and some really low cost advice and resources. So there's definitely something to have a look at. One of the resilience centres, one in the southwest actually, had last year had this presentation that they did in conjunction with the NFU around cybersecurity and modern farming specifically, and you can see some of the quotes that you've got on there. So that's just really one example of an area of business, if you like, that you might not necessarily think immediately that cybersecurity is a big risk in that industry, but obviously, as you can see there, that's not necessarily the case. Just in terms of background as well, there's a couple of things that sort of feed into cybersecurity risk as well. So the world's changing obviously all the time, business is changing. As a result, it's partly because of sort of world events. So we think about COVID over the last two years, the amount of people working from home and using their home networks, perhaps using their own devices to access corporate data and systems. And not being in that office environment where perhaps they get a little bit more training and they get a little bit more support. That's a big factor in something like cybersecurity awareness. And we are also going to talk a little bit about the Ukraine situation as well, because it's another really good example, and there's been some specific advice from various governments come out around this in terms of cybersecurity risk. So I'll talk a little bit about that because I think it's important to explain why that's the case. So we'll get onto that a little bit later on. I'm going to talk about some different types of threats later on. I would imagine that most, if not everybody's heard of phishing. So this is the emails that come through and trying to get you to click on a link or to download something to your machine, and that's an entry point for lots of cybersecurity attacks. and it accounts that entry point accounts for about 80% of data breaches, and it's growing, and it's something that's very, very difficult to stop with technology alone. In fact, that's quite a theme of when we talk to our clients and potential clients, is that one of those myths and misconceptions that I was talking about earlier on is that security is all about technology, and you can solve the cybersecurity problem just with a technological solution. This slide is something I like to just show, which demonstrates why that's basically not true. So this slide shows you various areas of cybersecurity and various types of systems and technical solutions you can buy to try and solve that problem. And you can see the number of different solutions that are available on this slide. So my question would always be, if you could solve it with technology alone, why are there so many different solutions that you can buy? Because surely there would just be one which would just solve all of the problems and everybody would buy that. And obviously that's not the case. So cybersecurity is about a lot more than just technology. It's about, in terms of solving that issue, it's very much about people and process as well. So we'll get into that a little bit later on as well. But in terms of background, probably worth just taking a step back and saying, okay, what is cybersecurity? What are we talking about here? So this is a kind of nice, very simple explanation about what we're talking about. So cybersecurity is a protection of systems and data from a breach of one of these three things. We call this the CIA triad in the trade. So this is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So systems and data, I'm talking about systems, we're talking about laptops, desktops, servers, cloud falls into this category, and also things like smartphones fall into this category. So these are all systems that you would use to process and store data. And data obviously then covers a whole raft of things. Because of, I'm sure some of you are familiar, if not all of you, with GDPR and data protection. So that's obviously been a big topic over the last couple of years. And it aligns very closely with cybersecurity. There's a lot of crossover between the two. But the one thing with GDPR is that it only focuses on what we call personal data. So that's data about individuals. There's lots of other types of data in a business that might be of value. So financial data, intellectual property, sales data, data on suppliers, data on contractors. There's all sorts of things from a cybersecurity point of view that are important, not just personal data. So it's important to remember that. But what we are talking about is protection of the systems and the data from a breach of any one of these three aspects. I'm going to talk about those. So firstly, confidentiality. So this is really mainly about data, and it is the data that you have and process within your organization, is it only accessible to the people who should have access to it and nobody else? So if that's not the case, then you've got a data breach, and this is something that cyber criminals might be trying to do. They might be trying to breach the confidentiality of that data, and we'll talk about why. The second one, by the way, the confidentiality piece is generally the one that everybody thinks of. So if you're thinking of cybersecurity and you're thinking of protecting the data, confidentiality is the one that immediately springs to mind for most people. It's, okay, is there a data breach? Has the data got out to somebody who shouldn't have it? There are two other aspects though. Integrity is really important. So this is about, has the data been changed? If the data has been changed, then, and particularly if you don't know that that data has been changed, then that can have a whole bunch of different effects. So for instance, if you think about bank account details, if somebody can change bank account details, then that can lead to payments in the wrong place and all of those kind of things. So that's the integrity of data. Also, in other types of systems, you think about a manufacturing process. If data's changed or systems changed and the integrity of that is violated in a manufacturing capacity, then that can have huge effects to what happens. And then you've got availability, and this is, are the systems up and available when we need to access them? Can we access the data that we need to run our business, to provide information to our clients and customers? And that can be compromised as well. So cybersecurity is really around protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of systems and data. So why do we need to protect it? Who wants access to our systems and data, and why? Who are they? Why might they attack you? So we could talk about cyber criminals, and we talk about cyber attacks. So hacking, ransomware, all of those things are different types of cyber attacks. So why might they do that? What's the motivation? What will they do with it? So if they do get access to your systems or your data or both, what are they going to do with it? How might they attack, and what they are ultimately after, which I guess is the same as the last point. So there are different types of cyber attackers, and actually there's a lot of parallels here between what I would call traditional forms of crime. And remember that cybersecurity, cyber attacks are a criminal act. Okay, so that's something that's always really important to remember, because sometimes if you're a victim of a cyber attack, a lot of businesses will not want to talk about that. They want to kind of hide that, and sometimes there's a little bit of embarrassment around it because you feel like you should have done more. But it's always really important to remember that cyber attacks are a criminal attack. So if you are attacked as a business, you're a victim of that. It's not your fault, right? So different types of attackers have different levels of capabilities. They have different motivations, and there are parallels. So if we start on the left, we have what we call, so different types of cyber criminals. We have what we call script kiddies. So this is a kind of term that's been around for a long time, and these are really people who are generally, and they might be quite young, they might be students, they might be just kind of playing around, learning how to hack. They might be just practicing, might be doing it for fun, and they might just hack into systems to see what they can do. But that can still have a damaging effect on an organization or an individual. Then you sort of move up to criminal gangs. So actually, if you think just from a parallels point of view, the script kiddies are probably like your sort of a bag snatcher, or someone who would just break into a car because they see a phone on the dashboard and they'll steal it. So probably a little bit opportunistic, not very organized particularly, and they just kind of I guess low level. Then you have criminals and sort of more hardened criminals and criminal gangs. So from a sort of again, parallels point of view, this would be more like your burglaries, your organized burglaries, targeted crime, anything up to very sophisticated, like kind of large kind of bank jobs and things like that. From a cybersecurity point of view, you have the same. So you have lots of different levels. You have individuals who are looking to launch cyber attacks. And then you have everything up to very well organized, very sophisticated, very well funded organized crime groups who are using cyber to actually launch the types of attacks they want to and try and get money that way. And most of those, by the way, are overseas. So they're very difficult to track and prosecute if you're a victim of one of those. Let's move on to a few different types. So then we have hacktivists. So these are people that are using cyber attacks for a cause that they believe in. So this might be terrorism, or it might be something different. Then you've got state-sponsored attacks. So there's some crossover sometimes between the cyber criminal groups and some of the state-sponsored attacks, because the states will sometimes use them. So when we talk about state-sponsored, we're talking about countries, and you can probably guess who those might be. And those are countries who they're using cyber in different things like warfare, for instance. So they would typically be doing things to disrupt. So actually they're more generally affecting that availability side of security. And they will be doing things like hacking power grids or disrupting banking operations in different countries and things like that. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about the Ukraine situation. But what we are going to get into, because it's what's relevant to everybody on this call, is how that actually affects businesses that are outside of that kind of core area that they might be trying to compromise. And then you have something called insider threats as well. And these are people who maybe sit inside of your organizations and have access to things that you wouldn't have access to from the outside. Sometimes that's malicious. So that could be a disgruntled employee, or it could be someone who's been actually put there specifically for that purpose, particularly in large organizations. Or actually insider threats could be accidental. So if you send an email out with a load of sensitive data on it and it goes to the wrong people, then that's what we call an accidental data breach, but we class that as an insider threat. So that's less of an attack, it's more of a mistake, but actually from a cybersecurity point of view, it's still a breach of one of those areas of data or systems that we're talking about. So all these different groups, what are they after? Well, they're after access to your systems. They might be after access to your systems to disrupt your access to them, but most commonly, they're accessing your systems because they want to get to the data that's within it. So, that's the reason for that. We also have something called supply chain attacks, which I'm going to talk to a little bit more about later on. And again, that's an area that's very relevant to particularly smaller businesses and smaller organizations. And they might be trying to access people. So they might be trying to access some data on you to do something like identity theft, for instance, or they might want to access your accounts or your details so that they can use that for some kind of attack within either your organization or something else that you have access to. Why? Money, normally. So there are look at those different types of attackers that we had earlier on. There are different reasons. So obviously some of it's not about money. Some of it's, if it's a hacktivist, they might be about a cause. But the vast majority of cyber attacks that you will see, the end goal is some kind of financial return. And data, in one way or another, normally has a value. For different reasons and there's different ways that can be leveraged to get a financial return, which we'll talk about as well. How do they do it? So lots of different ways that a cyber attack can happen, lots of the different ways that a cyber criminal can get access to your systems, access to your data, and ultimately use that. These are just some of them. I'm not going to go into the details of these because it would take obviously a lot longer than we have today, but just kind of be aware that there's lots of different things on here. There's also lots of different kind of categories. So actually, if we think about malware, ransomware, viruses, worms, all of these things tend to be very much through your kind of computer, and they might be launched through a phishing attack. That's how they might get in the first place. But then you also have other types of risks to the data and systems that you have, which are maybe not actually malicious. So we think it's worth putting them on this slide just to make sure that everybody's aware of them. So things like fire, theft, flood, if you have hardware, systems, data on your premises, and those are affected by those and not adequately protected, then obviously that can have an effect as well. And the reason I talk about those things as well is, what does it mean for your business? And actually, it can mean any of these things. So it can mean financial loss, right? So it can mean a direct financial loss. So that could actually be, as an example, it could be some ransomware that somebody then has access to your data. They've encrypted your data so you don't have access to it. And to get it back, you have to pay. So that's an immediate financial loss. Or it could be something like invoice fraud. So invoice fraud happens quite a lot via email, particularly to smaller businesses. And people end up paying an invoice to the wrong account because a cyber criminal has enabled that to happen. So that's again a direct financial loss. Another thing is lost productivity. So there's been some significant ransomware attacks, for instance. Ransomware is probably, I'll talk about ransomware quite a lot as I'm talking, because it's one of the kind of really biggest areas of risk for most organizations, because it can have multiple impacts. So it can have that financial loss, but it can also very much have an impact on productivity, because ransomware encrypts files on machines. So that could be laptops, it could be desktop machines, could be servers. Your business relies on those things, and if you can't use them, then you have a huge productivity issue. Quite often with a ransomware attack, machines will have to be rebuilt from scratch to overcome that problem. Reputational damage is another big one, particularly if you have any kind of business disruption or cyber attack that affects the data of the personal data of people's information that you store on them, particularly if that's sensitive in any way. So the reputational damage to your business can be significant in that case. Also, from that links with productivity as well, because if a cyber attack means that you can't run your business properly for a week or 3 weeks or a month, which is very common, by the way, those sort of timeframes, then that obviously has a reputational impact as well. Loss of trust from clients and customers if their data has been compromised it can be significant. And then obviously there is a sort of, there's almost a flip side at the bottom there, which is a competitive edge, because actually in a lot of industries, the majority of organizations are not really doing enough around cybersecurity. So actually, if you flip it around and you kind of get ahead of the curve and you do more than your peers are doing, then actually cybersecurity and doing a good job around it can give you a competitive edge, because you can talk about it and you can kind of increase that trust that we talked about, the one above, so it can have a positive. So just going back to, so we talked about different reasons that cyber events happen and what the impact is potentially on them. I'm going to talk a little bit about world events now, and the reason I want to talk about this is because if you look on this slide, what you can see is actually a lot of organizations around the world that deal with cybersecurity from a governmental point of view have issued advisories to businesses specifically around what's happening in Ukraine and what that means from a cybersecurity point of view. So you can see the one in the middle here, the NCSC that's the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, and so they've issued an advisory which says advising organisations to act. So we're going to talk about a little bit about why that is and what it means. This one here is CISA, so that's the sort of equivalent organisation in the US. Have done that as well. This is the same one here, and CNN, and this is FBI and CISA as well. So they're all talking about the same thing. They're all talking about a heightened threat from a cybersecurity point of view to businesses. And so I wanted to talk about why, because you might think, and it'd be totally natural to think this is why are businesses, why does that affect businesses? Surely, if there's a cybersecurity threat coming from Russia, surely that would be to do with things to do with government and military and those kind of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So basically, actually, the bottom point is the key, probably the key thing. So what's happening is that from a cybersecurity point of view, what these agencies are saying is that Russia, as well as traditional warfare, is also undertaking what we call cyber warfare. So what they're doing is they're trying to disrupt, particularly in Ukraine, so they're trying to disrupt things like power grids, they're trying to disrupt access to water supplies, to things like mobile networks, for instance. So all of those things they're trying to do in the Ukraine specifically. They might also potentially start to do those outside of the Ukraine as well, particularly if countries decide to be more aggressive towards Russia. They might react with sort of more concerted cyber attacks against different countries. So that could include us, could include the US, for instance. So that could happen. But the key thing actually is this thing here called a supply chain attack. So the way that cyber criminals operate is they'll go for the weakest link, right? So at a country level, most countries have very good cybersecurity. They have a lot of they have a lot of controls in place. They have a lot of technical controls. They also have a lot of controls around people and process. So it's quite hard, even for a kind of nation state. It's quite hard for them to kind of infiltrate directly into a network or to some systems. But because the world is so connected nowadays, all organizations, be they government organizations or business organizations, they all have a supply chain, and the supply chain includes lots of interaction between different systems, so that are outside of the control of an individual business, and there's lots of different things that have to be provided to those businesses. So for instance, systems themselves are made up of lots of different components. Those components come from lots of different places, and when they're built, if you can actually disrupt something in there or put something into there which gives you access into those systems later on, then that can cause quite a big problem. So how a supply chain works, this is very kind of typical example, right, is think about if you have some software on your laptops or your servers or within the cloud that allow you to run your business. So let's say an piece of accounting software, right? That's really important to you as a business. That accounting software will probably have nowadays an automated way of updating that software when there's a new version comes out. Okay, so you don't need to worry about it necessarily, it just updates itself. So actually what a cyber criminal could do, and this has happened before in these examples here, is that rather than trying to attack lots of individual organizations, what they'll do is they'll actually get access to the part of the software that does the updates. So they'll, if it's let's say Xero, for instance, right? Lots of people use Xero for accounting. So if they can compromise Xero, then what they could do is they could compromise the mechanism that updates the software, put some malicious software into there, and actually then when Xero updates all of their customers and all of the software that they have, then that piece of malicious software goes out to all of those customers. Okay. Now, what they might do is they might do that because they're trying to get they might be trying to attack a particular government department or a water company, for instance, and disrupt their operations because they know that they use Xero software. So they might do that. So they would succeed in doing that by this method, right? They wouldn't attack the company directly or the government department directly. They would attack Xero. Through that, they would then manage to disrupt that water company. But actually, by doing so, they would disrupt all of the other customers who use Xero as well. Okay, I picked on Xero just as an example because that's something we're familiar with. Could be any other type of software that you use. And this is one of the key areas of risk because there's more activity where Russia are attacking lots of different organizations, and they might be doing it through this supply chain method, which is very common. Then actually lots of other organizations could basically become collateral damage in that instance. So this is what happened before. So if you remember a few years ago, there was a huge problem with the NHS from a cyber attack point of view, and one of the first questions that lots of people asked me when that happened is, why would anybody attack the NHS? What are they going to get out of that? Because the NHS has no money, right? So they're not going to pay a big ransom. The NHS does great work. So why would we disrupt that? And actually the reality is they didn't target the NHS at all. They targeted someone else through this type of method. And just by nature of the fact that NHS have got some old systems or somebody happened to click on a link, It affected the NHS, and then actually it spread really easily because there was a lot of basic controls that weren't in place. So this kind of example here is really why all of these advisories have come out recently from our government and other government organisations as well. This one's just an example I saw just this morning, actually, so I'll pop this in here as well, because it's a good example of how this can affect people personally as well. So this banking Trojan, so a Trojan is a type of malicious software. This has basically done the same thing. It's targeted Android users. It's actually a banking Trojan, so it can give access to your bank apps, and it was done through compromising a piece of software that people downloaded from the Google Play Store. And it's affected several, I think 50,000 times that's been downloaded. So potentially there's 50,000 people out there who have downloaded a piece of software that they thought was fine, and actually what it's done in the background is it's given some attackers access to their banking apps on their phone. So very, very similar. So basically because this type of attack happens all the time, the more concerted efforts there are to compromise organization security, the more this is going to happen, and people are just kind of basically going to get caught, and businesses are going to get caught out, even if you're not targeted directly. And a lot of these happen because of some really common gaps in organizational security. So lots of different things here. A lot of them are kind of not what you perhaps would think about if you're thinking about cybersecurity. So most organizations that aren't, haven't put a lot of focus into security would think typically about things like firewalls, updating machines, antivirus, things like that, right? And those are what I would call very basic, fundamental things that every organization should be doing. There's a lot of gaps in those, and then there's a lot of gaps in things outside of those that these kind of attackers will exploit, either directly because they're targeting somebody, or indiscriminately, like we talked about. So things like backups are really important. So making sure you have backups of all your data, and you know how quickly you can get access to that data if it's lost or compromised in some way, and how quickly you can do that, and having a plan to do so. Antivirus coverage. So if you do have antivirus, basically making sure that you know every device that your systems are being accessed by and your data is being accessed by, and they all have it on, because it only takes one that doesn't have that on there to make that antivirus completely ineffective. Having multiple copies of data, but also, so that's kind of with the backups, but also making sure that you have an understanding of where data is. So if you have all of your data in, let's say, Google Cloud, as your organization, where else is it? Because as soon as you email some data to somebody, or you synchronize your data from Google Cloud to your phone, it's in more than one place. And if someone wants to get access to that data, again, they'll always go for the weakest link. So if you've got it nicely controlled within Google Cloud, or within a server in your office that's nicely protected, actually, if there's other copies of that data floating around, that's where someone will get it from. Cloud security is another one. So as on my first slide, cloud security, huge. So includes cloud security. Putting data in the cloud can be really good from a security point of view, but it's not good automatically. So there are things, elements of securing data in a cloud that the cloud company, be that Microsoft or Google or whoever it is, are responsible for. There's still a lot of elements of security that an organization themselves is responsible for when you put data in the cloud. So don't assume that just because you put it in the cloud it's secure. Policies, these are things a bit more administrative, but are really important from a security point of view. So things like policies, things like contracts and service level agreements and data sharing agreements are really important. Staff training is huge, hugely important, because you cannot solve these problems with technology alone, like we talked about earlier on. So actually making everybody aware of security and how they can help is a massive, massive area. Password management, things like multi-factor authentication. So where you don't just have a password, but you have a code separately, you have two things that you have to do to log in. That's actually a huge area which is underused, but is hugely beneficial from a security point of view. Encryption of data is often not looked at. BYOD is something is bring your own device. So that's anybody who's using their personal device to access corporate systems and data. The management of that is normally a big gap in lots of organizations. Individual user accounts. So if you're sharing user accounts with different people, big no-no. Everybody needs to have individual user accounts and their own individual passwords and not share them. And there's lots of reasons for that, which I don't have time to go into today, but I'll happily talk to you afterwards. Monitoring and auditing. This is a big area, even for quite mature organizations. Quite a lot of them don't have a really good visibility of what's happening with their data and their networks and their systems. If you don't have visibility of it, then actually how do you know if somebody's compromised them unless it's very obvious? Bear in mind with this is a lot of cyber attacks and what we call malicious hardware or malware, software, in quite a lot of occasions, this will actually sit on your machines or in your network for potentially several months before anybody utilizes it from a cyber criminal point of view. So actually, if you're able to detect that happening, then you can prevent it from becoming a big problem. Updating applications is a big area, a big gap. So that's really all the sort of Microsoft updates that you do for your operating system are really important, but actually you also need to update all of your applications as well, because a lot of cyber attacks rely on what we call vulnerabilities in software, and the updates to the applications are designed to close those vulnerabilities. If you don't do the updates, the vulnerabilities still exist. And then a couple of other ones, least privilege. So that's really making sure that people only have access to the minimum level of data access they need to do their job. Documentation. A lot of organizations don't have any documentation around security and ways of policies or processes. And this one here, incident response plan. There's two sides to security. One is preventative. So that's really trying to stop an attacker getting into your systems, data, getting access to it in the first place. No company, no organization in the world can guarantee that 100%. Even companies who are spending millions on cybersecurity cannot protect their networks 100% and prevent things 100%. It's simply not possible. So the more you do, preventative wise, the less likely it is that you're going to have an issue. But if you do have an issue, it's really, really important that you have a plan for dealing with that. And that includes how to contain the problem, how to detect the problem in the first place, how to contain it, how to communicate it internally and externally. Lots of different aspects to that. Having an incident response plan is absolutely critical if you do have an issue. So it's really about thinking about it in advance and making sure that you have a predetermined way to do it, and you're not trying to make really important critical decisions on the fly when you're in the midst of a cyber attack. So quick question, who's responsible for cybersecurity in a business? And you could argue all of these things, all of these groups. Actually, that's absolutely true. They're all responsible. However, back to our original slide, many organizations would only answer this one. Right? And that's simply not the case. Actually, as with many things, it starts at the top, really. So if your leadership team and the owners of the business don't understand the problem with security, and they don't invest and they don't enable everybody within the business to have a good idea of what it's about and put the things in place that need to be there, then you're setting up for failure, really. So all of these groups are really important, but I would say it's got to start at the top. Some fundamentals. So this is going on to really what we can do about security. So firstly, understand what is critical to the business or the organization. So this is the really critical thing. Lots of people do security and they do it very tactically. They'll buy solutions, they'll put IT controls in place, they'll do different things without really having a good understanding of what it is they're trying to protect. So we might call this the crown jewels, right? From a data point of view and a systems point of view, what are the crown jewels within your business? Is it intellectual property? Do you have intellectual property data that if somebody got hold of it, it would basically finish your business? I have a client who said that exactly to me last week. If somebody gets access to that intellectual property that we have before we've managed to get a patent on that data, on that system, our business is finished. So understanding what that is might be intellectual property, might be financial data, might be personal data, might be really sensitive data that you have on people. So understanding what's critical to the business and what the impact on the business if one of those things is compromised is critical. Then understand what the vulnerabilities and threats are. So how could that be attacked? How could somebody externally get access to it? Assess what the risks and the impact is to your business or your organization. So if somebody does get that, what does it mean? And then you can apply controls to reduce or mitigate that. And in some cases, you might choose to accept the risk, right? Risk is a business decision. So you might say, okay, this data over here, that isn't quite so important. So actually, we're quite happy to take the risk because it's going to be too expensive to protect it. But if you don't do these things, what you'll tend to do is you'll start spending money on things that actually perhaps aren't quite so important and not spending it in the right areas. So this stuff is really important. I mentioned earlier on, it's not just about technology, it's about policies and process, it's about people, and it's about technology. So all of those things are really important. And from a principle of planning, as I just mentioned, really, understand first, then you can plan, then you can put your protections in place, and then you can manage that and update it on an ongoing basis and evolve, because it is an evolution. You always need to be updating. A couple of quick wins I want to just talk about. So firstly, doing the basics. And if you don't know what those basics are, talk to us or go on to the bottom one here, which is ncsc.gov.uk. That's the National Cyber Security Centre, and they have some really, really good advice. Really kind of, there's a lot of it's quite straightforward as well, for different sizes of businesses, for different industries, different levels of experience and knowledge around security, around what you can do. So I'd definitely recommend going to have a look at those. Also look up the Cyber Resilience Centre for the East of England. That's another place that you can go to get some really good free advice. And then obviously you can talk to us if you wish to as well. But those first two, all free advice, all really good. So I definitely advocate looking at those, and then make sure you've got the basics in place. So look at Cyber Essentials and look at what's called 10 Steps to Cyber, 10 Steps to Cyber Security on the NCSC website. Really useful sources of information. Two-factor authentication on all possible applications. So I'll just go back to what that is again. And for anybody who doesn't know, when you log in to a system, whether it's a cloud system or your phone or whatever it is, you have a username and a password. That compromising passwords is not difficult in a lot of cases, particularly if you reuse them. That's a really bad idea. And putting two-factor authentication in place, where you also get sent a code, or you have an authenticator application where you need to put a code in as well as that username and password, is hugely beneficial from a security point of view. If I had to tell people to do one thing, that's the one. Make sure you've got two-factor authentication on particularly your critical applications, particularly your email, but really anything that you can. Make sure you've got two-factor authentication on it. And then the other thing is passwords. If you again, I haven't got time to go through everything today, but if you reuse your password, that means you have the same password against lots of different systems that you log into. Please, please, please stop doing that. Really, really bad idea. Because if a cyber criminal compromises one system that you log into, they basically can compromise all of them. So having different passwords across all of the systems that you log into is really important, as well as using two-factor authentication. And if you can't remember lots of different passwords, which is the reason that most people don't have different passwords across every system, you can use something called a password manager, and that will secure all of the different passwords for all of the different systems for you. Happy to talk to anybody more about details of that if they need advice on it. So those are the quick wins, things you could do sort of following on from that. This thing here, when I said about starts from the top earlier on, this is really important. Allocate resources with business commitment. So understand what it is you need to achieve. If you need help with that, then get some help with it. And then you can allocate resources in terms of people and in terms of investment in technology and advice based on your specific organization. Create and update policies. These are really important from a kind of consistency point of view and making sure everybody knows what their responsibilities are, defining those. User awareness training, and also training for business leaders as well, which is a different kind of slightly different. That's hugely beneficial. Incident response planning I talked about earlier on, and disaster recovery and business continuity planning, that goes a bit broader than cybersecurity, but actually making sure that you know that what you're going to do if events happen and elements of your business are not able to operate, having a plan B in place for those things, that's really important as well. So that's all I wanted to cover. I've taken a bit longer than I wanted to take. I wanted to leave a little bit more time for questions. If anybody does have any immediate questions, I'm quite happy to try and answer them now, or if you want to follow up with me afterwards, quite happy to do that as well. Okay, so not hearing any questions at the moment. So what we'll do is we'll follow up afterwards. I'll make sure everybody's got my email details. And then obviously if you have any follow-up questions, then feel free to get in touch either by email or you can call us here and I will help as best I can. So aside from that, just want to say thank you very much for attending this morning, everybody. And follow up if you wish, and I will let you get on for the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.